1924. That was the largest immigration to America, people coming mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. Today, we're going to look at immigration between 1924 and 1965. And that was a period when immigration was drastically curtailed, and anti-immigrant sentiment was particularly damaging to three groups during this period. Mexicans who were seeking work in the United States, a second group who suffered from anti-immigration sentiment were Americans of Japanese descent during World War II. And the third group were European Jews desperate to escape the Nazi Holocaust. Racial antagonism fueled attacks on specific ethnic groups, and California led the way with laws restricting Asian immigrants from owning land. During the Depression of the 1930s, Mexican immigrants were rounded up and forcibly deported. Then during World War II, they were invited back, only to be rounded up and deported again in the 1950s. In the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast were put in internment centers, and anti-Semitism in the United States was instrumental in preventing Jewish refugees from coming to America. So that is a preview of what we're going to be looking at in today's lecture. So let's begin with how immigration laws affected people coming from Mexico. You remember last week we left off with this 1924 Immigration Quota Act that placed restrictions on European immigrants coming from specific countries, and it worked against immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. But despite this 1924 Quota Act, immigrants continued to come from Europe, but largely from Northern and Western Europe, from Scandinavia, from the British Isles, from Germany. And that was precisely what this new law intended. It was biased against immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, but generous to immigrants coming from Northern and Western Europe. But others came to the United States from the Western Hemisphere, from Canada and Mexico. Countries in the Western Hemisphere were exempt from this 1924 quota. Congress did absolutely nothing to stop immigration coming from Mexico, because Mexican labor was desperately needed for railroad construction, for work in mines, construction, and on farms. In fact, after Chinese immigration was banned, Mexican workers became even more necessary. And Mexicans had an advantage over the Chinese because they were easier to deport across the long southern border when they were deemed no longer necessary. But many, in fact, preferred to maintain their homes in Mexico and come to the United States for short-term migration, for seasonal or temporary jobs. So Mexicans were welcome, just they were not welcomed as immigrants or potential citizens. Rather, they were seen as eminently deportable temporary workers. Immigration restrictionists did manage to get a bill passed by the Senate in 1930 to ban immigration from Mexico, but the Hoover administration opposed the bill because it wanted to improve relations with Mexico. Then came the Great Depression of the 1930s. No longer was there any demand for foreign workers. Unemployment reached 25%. Between 1932 and 1935, the number of immigrants leaving the United States exceeded the number of immigrants entering the country. Clearly, it's easier to be poor in a poor country than in a rich one. And so many immigrants who had come over still had support networks in the old country. And so during the Depression, many of them left the United States to go back to the country of origin. Throughout the decade of the 1930s, immigration averaged just about 6,900 a year. So here is the number of immigrants per decade, and you can see the drastic decline when the Depression hit. Just about 6,900 immigrants coming per year. When you compare that to 1914, more people than that entered the United States every 2 days than entered the United States on the average in the 1930s. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover ordered American consulates to interpret immigration laws more rigidly to make it more difficult to immigrate to the United States. Before this, only people who were unable to support themselves had been kept out. Now, applicants had to get affidavits of support from relatives or others already in the country in order to demonstrate that they could support the immigrant who wanted to come to the United States. And nativists wanted to expel those Mexicans working in the United States. And so in the 1930s, there was a forced exodus of Mexicans out of the United States. Laws were established to deprive Mexicans of employment, and immigration policy was tightened. American authorities held raids in workplaces and in public places where they rounded up Mexicans and Mexican Americans alike to deport them. The most famous of these roundups was in downtown Los Angeles at Placita Olivera in 1931. Now, the government didn't call it deportation. Instead, it euphemistically referred to these roundups as repatriation. That is, returning people to their native land. Repatriation carries connotations that it's voluntary, that people are making their own decision without pressure to return to the country of their nationality. But most obviously, how voluntary is it if you have deportation raids by the federal government and people are disappearing off the streets? How voluntary is it if you have county agents knocking on people's doors telling people, oh, you'd be better off in Mexico, and here's your train ticket. You should be ready to go in 2 weeks. But about 60% of the people in the Mexican repatriation drive were actually US citizens of Mexican descent. And so even though they were deported, that was illegal. It has been estimated that anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million were deported from the United States throughout the 1930s. And this map shows the states where you had the largest numbers of deportations. Some of those deported were undocumented, some were legal residents, and some were actually US citizens, many of them born in the United States. But this was in the depths of the Depression, when most Americans were not concerned about abuses or injustice in the deportation process, particularly if deported Mexicans meant that there would be more job opportunities for white Americans. During the Depression, no nation openly welcomed immigrants, and many countries expelled them if they could only find grounds for expulsion and places to ship them to. What gave American immigration and deportation policies their special irony is that those policies represented such a sharp break with prior laws and practices that the United States represented. The tradition of welcoming newcomers stood in stark contrast to this policy of now deporting people who had come to the United States. But then things changed drastically during World War II. Because in World War II, with so many American soldiers overseas, there was a desperate shortage of workers in the United States. So that persuaded Congress to enact emergency labor legislation that now allowed millions of Mexican men to come to the United States to work on short-term agricultural labor contracts. It was known as the Bracero Program. That was named for the Spanish term bracero, which means manual labor, or one who works using his arms. This Bracero program lasted 22 years, from 1942 to 1964. It offered employment contracts to 5 million desperate and exploitable Mexican workers. So here you could see the numbers of people from Mexico who were brought over through the Bracero program. The program guaranteed a minimum wage of 30 cents an hour, and it promised humane treatment, adequate food and shelter, and temporary working visas. Once those contracts expired, the workers were supposed to return to Mexico. Now, some came for a few months, some for longer periods. Many came but went back home in a seasonal cycle. Others in the Bracero program overstayed their work visas, which led to a subculture of undocumented immigrants. But in Western cities, Mexican Americans were subjected to prejudice and discrimination, and they lagged significantly behind in education, in income, and in occupational status. Some younger Latinos, alienated from both white society and from their parents' generation, they joined gangs in Los Angeles and other cities. They called themselves PACHUCOS, and they wore zoot suits, which was a full coat reaching to the mid-thigh, trousers that were flat at the knee but very narrow at the ankles, thick-soled shoes, and a felt pancake hat with a long keychain. On May 31st, 1943, a group of white sailors on leave clashed with a group of young Latinos in downtown Los Angeles. And that resulted in a violence known as the Zoot Suit Riot. Around 200 sailors and Marines hired a fleet of taxicabs and drove into East Los Angeles to continue fighting with Mexican American youths. And they specifically targeted young men dressed in zoot suits. The Los Angeles Police Department initially refused to intervene, and newspapers placed the blame entirely on the Pachucos, even though they were the victims. As the violence escalated over the ensuing days, thousands of servicemen joined the attack, marching abreast down the streets, entering bars and movie houses to assault any young Latino male they encountered. Now, sailors and Marines initially targeted only Pachucos, but African Americans dressed in zoot suits were also victimized. Although police accompanied the rioting servicemen, they had orders not to arrest any of them. After several days, more than 150 people had been injured, and police had arrested 500 Latinos on charges ranging from rioting to vagrancy. Then, Los Angeles passed a law banning the zoot suit within the confines of the city. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt described the riots as race riots, rooted in long-term discrimination against Mexican Americans. And that led to an outraged response from the Los Angeles Times, which printed an editorial the following day accusing the First Lady of having communist leanings and stirring race discord. Yes, in the 1940s, the Los Angeles Times was a very conservative newspaper. Now, because of the push-pull nature of immigration, bringing people when they were needed most, then forcing them out when they were no longer needed, that process imprinted the image of the Mexican as a useful but disposable outsider. And so this cartoon shows this duality of when immigrants are wanted, when there's a need for cheap labor, but Immigrants then get deported when there is no longer a need for that cheap labor. So the Bracero program also brought in its wake an increasing number of undocumented immigrants. By 1954, pressure was building from a broad coalition of farm and business interests who were concerned with the effects of illegal aliens. It was at that point that the Eisenhower administration launched what they called Operation Wetback, a military-style operation that lasted 1 year, during which time the government is estimated to have rounded up more than 1 million people. The intention was to target illegal immigrants, though some US citizens of Mexican ancestry were also caught up in the dragnet. And just like in the 1930s, harsh treatment and harsh methods were used, sometimes sending deportees to unfamiliar parts of Mexico where they would struggle to find their way home. Mass deportations were conducted every day during Operation Wetback. More than 4,800 undocumented immigrants were captured on the first day. By the end of 1954, 1.1 million people were returned to Mexico. And of course, today, wetback is a pejorative that people would be very hesitant to use. But in the 1950s, the US government didn't see anything wrong with using that as a term for their deportation program. So this revolving door of recruitment and deportation came to define Mexican migration to the United States. And that would only reinforce the tenuousness of the Mexican presence in this country. So at the beginning, I mentioned that there were 3 distinct groups that were adversely affected by immigration policy in the period 1924 to 1965. Mexicans, Japanese, and European Jews. So now let's take a look at how immigration policy affected Asian immigrants. World War II represented a watershed in the history of the Asian presence in the United States. Asians were asked to serve in the armed forces and to support the United States throughout the war. The war also highlighted the contradiction of Americans fighting fascist racism abroad while tolerating racism at home. At Bataan, thousands of Filipinos fought besides American soldiers, which forced whites in the United States to view Filipinos more respectfully. Filipino soldiers made a unique and valuable contribution to the war effort in the Pacific, operating behind enemy lines and engaging in sabotage against the Japanese. As members of the US Armed Forces, Filipinos were allowed to become citizens and were encouraged to take over land holdings that had belonged to Japanese Americans. Facing fascism overseas, the United States felt compelled to make good on its claims to democracy at home. In 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in government employment, and that allowed Filipinos to be hired in war industries in the United States. By 1946, the United States granted the Philippines independence and extended citizenship to Filipino immigrants. Now, Koreans in America welcomed World War II, hoping that it would lead to the defeat of Japan, because up to World War II, Korea was a colony ruled by Japan. But on the other hand, some Koreans in the United States were mistaken for Japanese, and they were attacked. In addition, government policies failed to distinguish Koreans from the Japanese. In 1940, the Alien Registration Act classified Korean immigrants as subjects of Japan, because once again, Japan had control of Korea. After the US declared war on Japan in December of 1941, Koreans in America were identified as enemy aliens. Nevertheless, Koreans played a vital role in helping to bring about the defeat of Japan. Many Koreans knew the Japanese language, and so they served to translate secret Japanese documents and to broadcast anti-Japanese propaganda on the Pacific Front. And as a result, Korean involvement in the war effort generated respect on the part of white Americans towards Koreans. Chinese Americans also benefited from America's participation in World War II. On the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States and China became allies in a war against Japan. 2 weeks later, on December 22nd, Time magazine explained to its readers how to distinguish the Chinese friend from the Japanese enemy. And this is what appeared in Time magazine: how to tell your friends from the Japs. And I will just cite some of the things in this article. It said, virtually all Japanese are short. Japanese are likely to be stockier and broader hipped than the short Chinese. The Chinese expression is likely to be more placid, kindly, open. The Japanese more dogmatic, arrogant. Just 1 second here. The Japanese are hesitant, nervous in conversation. They laugh loudly at the wrong time. The Japanese walk stiffly erect, hard-heeled. The Chinese are more relaxed. They have an easy gait. They sometimes shuffle. Well, these are really outrageous stereotypes, and we can laugh at them now, but it really represents this effort so that white Americans would not attack Chinese people in the United States, mistaking them for the Japanese. Almost immediately after December 7th, the Chinese were no longer regarded with scorn. Chinese workers suddenly found employment opportunities open to them, especially in American defense industries. The war also opened employment opportunities for Chinese women as well. Most significantly, in 1943, in the middle of the war, Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusionary Act, which once again permitted Chinese immigration, even though the American Federation of Labor was very much opposed to repealing the Chinese Exclusion Act. This 1943 law also reversed the 1790 statute by extending the right of naturalized citizenship to Chinese immigrants. The original naturalization law back in 1790 said it was only open to whites. The 1943 law meant that Asians could now become naturalized citizens. Now, while World War II improved the situation for Korean and Chinese Americans, it proved disastrous for Japanese Americans, who were forcibly placed in internment camps by the US government. Though they were just a tiny minority on the West Coast, they were visible and extremely vulnerable, particularly after the Pearl Harbor attack. Now, interestingly, while 110,000 Japanese Americans were ultimately incarcerated, only a few Japanese in Hawaii were similarly relocated. And the reason that the vast majority of Japanese in Hawaii remained free is because they were so important to the island's economy. But faced with mounting pressure, the US Army cited military necessity as the reason for rounding up Japanese Americans, whether or not they were citizens, rounding them up from the West Coast. However, interestingly, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, did not believe that the Japanese represented a security threat to America. On the other hand, many Americans agreed with an Los Angeles Times editorial that declared, quote, "A Japanese American born of Japanese parents grows up to be a Japanese, not an American. According to President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, calling for the evacuation of 110,000 Americans of Japanese heritage, 2/3 of whom were US citizens, the executive order called for them to be rounded up and sent to one of 10 internment camps that you see on this map. They were officially called relocation centers. They were in California, Idaho, Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, Colorado, and Arkansas. Some texts refer to them as concentration camps. And I would say that is technically accurate because they were concentrated in a confined space. But that should not be confused with Nazi death camps, which were also concentration camps, but which intended to kill the people within those confined areas. The Executive Order 9066 intended to confine Japanese Americans, but not to kill them. That executive order applied to everyone of Japanese descent, even children. The fact that some of them were born in the United States and therefore American citizens, that made absolutely no difference. They were instructed that they would be allowed to take only what they could carry. They had to sell most of their possessions, refrigerators, cars, furniture, radios, pianos, even their houses. When they reported to the train station, they were surrounded by soldiers armed with rifles and bayonets. The US internment camps were located in remote desert areas. They were overcrowded with poor living conditions, with guard towers, searchlights, machine gun installations on the perimeters of the camps. Two important legal cases were brought against the United States concerning this internment. The landmark cases were Hirabayashi versus the United States, 1943, and Kuramatsu versus the United States, 1944. In these cases, the defendants argued that their Fifth Amendment rights were violated by the US government because of their ancestry. And in both cases, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government. In December 1944, 2.5 years after signing of Executive Order 9066, the government announced that the West Coast was no longer considered a war zone. And so President Franklin Roosevelt rescinded the order, and the last internment camp was closed by the end of 1945. When the former internees returned home, many found their houses damaged and their fields ruined. As a postscript, in 1988, Congress passed legislation to award formal payments of $20,000 to each of the surviving internees. And that raised the issue that if the United States was going to compensate for people they wronged, such as the Japanese Americans, why shouldn't there be compensation to the survivors of slavery? But that's a totally different issue. Now, after World War II, Asians were once again allowed to come to the United States, but within strict quotas. In 1952, the McCarren-Walter Act nullified the 1790 naturalization law, which cleared the way for Asian immigrants to gain naturalized citizenship, as I mentioned before. Now let us take a look at the third group, the group that suffered the most from the discriminatory 1924 immigration law. And that group were European Jews, desperate to escape Nazi-dominated Europe in the 1930s. The 1924 immigration law made no distinction between immigrants and refugees. And the progressive president in the White House during the 1930s, FDR, was the idol of many American Jews. But he was not willing to swim against the tide by attempting to change that 1924 immigration law. In 1933, German Jews lost all civil rights after Hitler came to power. As the noose tightened around many German Jews, America could have admitted more refugees, but it refused. The sentiment in the US State Department was extremely anti-Semitic. Historians have referred to paper walls, meaning the use of bureaucracy to deny immigrants entry into the United States. And that is the title of a book by David Wyman, Paper Walls, America and the Refugee Crisis. American embassies and consulates were told to make it as difficult as possible for refugees to come to America during the Hitler period. And the reason was that anti-Semitism was endemic in the United States in the 1930s and early 1940s. Father Charles Coughlin was one of the most popular radio personalities of his time, and his anti-Semitic rants were broadcast weekly, coast to coast. Other well-respected Americans, such as Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, were equally vehemently opposed to Jews. In February of 1939, 19,000 people gathered in New York's Madison Square Garden for a rally in honor of George Washington's birthday. This rally was organized by the German-American Bund, a pro-Nazi organization. During the 1930s, anti-Semitism began to affect the climate in which Jews were living in the United States. Signs began to appear, dogs and Jews not allowed in some beaches and hotels, or no Hebrews or tubercular guests received. Even the wealthiest Jews were barred from entering certain social clubs and vacation resorts. The New Deal was seen by many as a Jewish conspiracy. Anti-Semites referred to the president as Rosenfeld, and they called the New Deal the Jew Deal. American Jews were seen by some as agents of international communism, or because they opposed Nazi Germany, Jews were suspect of trying to drag America into another world war. In 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, in November of that year, Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, these were attacks on Jewish-owned property and synagogues throughout Germany and Austria. And it led to a flood of visa applications from desperate Jews who wanted to get to America. The sudden flood of potential immigrants created a major refugee crisis. During 1938 and 39, in a program known as the Kindertransport, Britain admitted 10,000 unaccompanied Jewish children on an emergency basis. But a similar attempt to admit 20,000 Jewish children in the United States, known as the Wagner-Rogers Act, was defeated in Congress. So if we look at this public opinion poll, which posed the question, it has been proposed to bring to this country 20,000 refugee children from Germany, most of them Jewish, to be taken care of in American homes. Should the government permit these children to come in? 30% of respondents said yes, 61% said no. And so that gives you a sense of the sentiment in the United States towards Jews desperate to get out of Nazi-dominated Europe. As the wife of the US Commissioner of Immigration remarked at a cocktail party, she said, quote, 20,000 children would all too soon grow up to be 20,000 ugly adults. So instead of relaxing immigration quotas, American officials worked to persuade Latin American countries and Great Britain to admit Jewish refugees so that the United States would not have to. President Roosevelt convened a conference in Evian, France in July 1938 to deal with the refugee crisis. Despite participation of delegates from 32 countries, including the United States, the only country willing to accept Jewish refugees was the Dominican Republic. And so this cartoon of the Evian Conference shows a Jewish person desperate to emigrate, but with no place to go. Opinion polls before and during World War II reflected widespread public fear and animosity towards Jews in the United States. The American Jewish community felt besieged and vulnerable at a time when Jews in Europe were under attack. In 1938, a public opinion poll asked the question, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the US to live? When that question was posed in March of 1938, only 17% said yes, let in Jewish exiles from Germany. 75% said no. When that question was asked in November of 1938, the results were similar. Before America's entry into World War II, American public opinion was solidly opposed to increasing the number of Jews allowed to come into the United States, despite how desperate they were to escape Nazi oppression. The plight of German Jewish refugees persecuted at home and unwanted abroad was illustrated by the voyage of this ship, the SS St. Louis. In a highly publicized event in May of 1939, the SS St. Louis left Hamburg, Germany, with more than 900 refugees aboard. And they were headed for Cuba because they had transit visas, which would allow them to disembark from the ship to live in Cuba. But Cuban authorities canceled the refugees' transit visas, denying entry to most of the passengers. Some, just a handful, were allowed to get off. And so the ship then sailed along the coast of Florida, requesting permission to let the passengers off in the United States. But immigration authorities refused the issuance of visas to those refugees. And so, because they were denied permission to land in the United States, the ship was forced to return to Europe. And so this map shows the voyage of the St. Louis from Hamburg to Cuba along the Miami coast, and then returning to Europe on June 17th, 1939. And so a sense of desperation engulfed American Jews. They were afraid to speak out on behalf of their European brethren because they didn't want to draw unwelcomed attention in an America that was overwhelmingly anti-Semitic. Even during World War II, anti-Semitism in the United States continued. And so this question was posed in 1943. Do you think it would be a good idea or a bad idea to let more immigrants come into this country after the war? Well, only 13% thought it was a good idea. 78% thought it was a bad idea. And this question, in your opinion, what nationality, religious, or racial groups are a menace to America? They were asked to rate which of the following groups represented the greatest menace to America. When this question was asked in August 1940, as you can see, more people identified Jews as the greatest threat to the United States than any of the other groups listed: Blacks, Catholics, Germans, or Japanese. The question was asked again in February of 1941. And again, more people identified Jews as the greatest threat to the United States. In October, 1 out of every 5 people polled said that Jews represented the greatest threat. After the United States entered the war, the percentage identifying Jews as the greatest threat fell to 15%, and a larger percentage identified Germans and Japanese because they were now our enemies in World War II. And that continued as the poll asked the same question in December of 1942. But notice this, by June 1944, 1 in 4 people polled now identified Jews as the greatest threat to America. Only 6% identified Germans, only 9% identified Japanese. So FDR was stuck between wanting to appease the American Jewish community, but also wanting to placate nativists and isolationists. And his State Department consistently made it difficult for most Jewish refugees to enter the United States, even though in many cases, the quota that had been set by the 1924 law had not even been met. In other words, more Jews could have been allowed to come in from Europe under the existing quota, but the State Department made sure that that would not happen. In fact, once the United States entered World War II, the State Department practiced even stricter immigration policies out of fear that Nazi spies and saboteurs might be hidden among the refugees if they allowed refugees coming in from Europe. By then, the trickle of immigration had virtually dried up, just as the Nazi regime began the systematic murder of the Jews of Europe. But despite many obstacles, more than 200,000 Jews found refuge in the United States from 1933 to 1945 under the combined German-Austrian quota. Most of them came before the end of 1941. It wasn't until January 1944 that President Roosevelt, under pressure from officials in his own government and under pressure from an American Jewish community, which was then fully aware of the Holocaust, it was only then that Roosevelt took action to rescue European Jews. Following discussions with the Treasury Department officials, FDR established the War Refugee Board to facilitate the rescue of imperiled refugees. The War Refugee Board helped to rescue thousands of Jews in Hungary, Romania, and elsewhere in Europe. It created a camp for refugees in the upstate New York town of Oswego, the first and only refugee center established in the United States. In August of 1944, the shelter in Oswego received 982 refugees, almost 90% of Jewish descent. A major concern with the establishment of the camp was the issue of immigration. Roosevelt circumvented the rigid immigration quota by identifying these refugees not as immigrants, but as his, quote, guests. But that status gave them no legal standing, and it required them to return back to Europe once conditions permitted their repatriation. The refugees would merely be in the United States not as citizens. They would have no visa status. President Roosevelt also assured Congress that the Army would not permit any of the refugees in Fort Ontario to escape. Initially, plans were made to install spotlights along the existing 6-foot chain link fence, as well as having armed guards around the camp perimeter. But neither of these things were implemented. Because of their undefined immigrant status, the refugees were not permitted to leave Fort Ontario, even to work or to visit family members already settled in the United States. So they struggled to create a community within the camp, but the close quarters and their uncertain futures made for very tense relations. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the question of what to do with the camp became a pressing issue. Internment was becoming increasingly difficult to support. Advocates for the refugees continually lobbied Congress and the president to allow them to stay in America. Finally, after 18 months in the camp, then President Truman permitted their legal entry into the United States. The shelter was closed a short time later in February of 1946. Ultimately, the Allied victory brought an end to the Nazi terror in Europe and to the war in the Pacific. However, liberated Jews suffering from illness and exhaustion emerged from concentration camps and hiding places to discover a world which really had no place for them. Holocaust survivors were sent to displaced persons camps, or DP camps, throughout Europe. Most tried to begin a new life outside Europe. Palestine was the most favored destination of Holocaust survivors, followed by the United States. But immigration restrictions were still in effect in this country after the war, and legislation to expedite the admission of Jewish displaced persons was really slow in coming. President Truman favored a liberal immigration policy towards the DPs. Faced with congressional inaction, in 1945, he issued an executive order called the Truman Directive, which allowed 15,000 Jewish displaced persons to enter the United States. In 1948, Congress passed legislation to admit 400,000 DPs. Nearly 80,000 of these, or about 20%, were Jewish. By 1952, 137,000 Jewish refugees, including close to 100,000 DPs, were allowed to settle in the United States. Now we're going to turn to immigration during the Cold War. As the Cold War dawned on American policy in the years immediately following the end of World War II, immigration policy adapted. The State Department realized how difficult it was for the United States to become the leader of the free world when American immigration and naturalization policies blatantly discriminated against the majority of the world's people. In addition, to win the hearts and minds of people in the developing world, policymakers realized it was necessary to loosen American immigration policy. The McCarren-Walter Act, otherwise known as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, was meant to move away from excluding immigrants based simply on their country of origin. Instead, during the McCarthy Red Scare, the law focused on denying immigrants who were communists and others who were considered a serious threat to American democracy. So as you can see here, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 restricted immigration in the sense that it allowed the government to deport immigrants or naturalized citizens engaged in subversive activities and allowed the barring of suspected subversives from entering the country. But the law also ended the exclusion of Asians from immigrating to the United States. It eliminated laws that prevented Asians from becoming naturalized American citizens. But in reality, it continued to discriminate against them because while the law repealed measures to exclude Asian immigration, it allotted each Asian country a minimum quota of just 100 visas a year. The United States opened its gates for refugees of Cold War conflicts. And so, when the Hungarian Revolution broke out in 1956, the United States admitted tens of thousands of Hungarian refugees. And refugees of the Cuban Revolution of 1960 were allowed to come in to the United States, Cubans who wanted to escape Castro's rule. During the Cold War, the United States accepted 2.5 million refugees, mostly from communist countries, including 750,000 Cubans and 400,000 refugees from America's wars in Southeast Asia. And that was in the 1970s, with a large number of refugees coming from Vietnam and from Cambodia. Okay, just one second here. I'm having a little technical difficulty with the PowerPoint. Oh, okay. Well, this pretty much concludes the lecture for today, carrying the history of immigration from 1924 to 1965. Next week is the last lecture, when we will trace American immigration policy from 1967 to the present, because as we speak, President Biden is formulating a bill that he would like Congress to pass to liberalize American immigration policy. So I will be talking about Biden's program at the end of the lecture next week. So at this point, we can stop and